Or to this computer. Okay. Oh God. Got to get my bifocals up there. Okay. Blasting horns, banging drums, and blaring singers made jazz popular in North Omaha. But did you know the community has a rich history of classical, gospel, and other forms of music. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the people, places, and events that make the history of music in the community spectacular. Take it away, Adam.
Gigantic horns blasting out of the Dreamland Ballroom right there at 24th and Grant. Crowds just pouring out the front door, waiting to climb the stairs and go into this big dance floor with the big band at the front of the stage and people just wailing away, really taking in that ambiance and the feeling of the entire occasion. Preston Love Sr. wrote in his autobiography, A Thousand Honey Creeks, all about being a kid and sitting on the back stairs of the Dreamland Ballroom and listening to Count Basie and all these other uh, great swing bands, jazz bands from the 1930s as they plied their trade and did their work. It wasn't just the Dreamland Ballroom. It was the Carnation Ballroom. It was the Offbeat Club. It was all kinds of spectacular places that we know about and can imagine. We have today a beautiful sculpture that's right along 24th Street and in the Dreamland Park Plaza that really holds that feeling. But there was so much more than just jazz. For as big as that was, and as big as it is still today, North Omaha has been the home to all kinds of music for a very long time. And Steve, I really want to dig into that right now and just really take on this idea that the musical history of North Omaha was so much more. When we look across that big old musical heritage, we can see that everything from early church choirs and classical performers has given way to hip hop today and all kinds of rock and roll and great stuff from all kinds of different places. And I want to dig into that. I want to paint that picture. I want to start by going way back to the pioneers in the early era of North Omaha, really looking back at even before there was European settlement, even before the 1854 when Omaha was founded, Native Americans, of course, had their own culture and their own music, their own ways of playing their hearts and putting out their passion and really understanding that musically. A lot of European Americans, white people like me, a lot of people of color understand that Native Americans have their instrumentation, drums and flutes. And they also have so many songs and so many stories that they would share in that way. Today, there are still people who practice that native music, whether they are Lakota, whether they are Pawnee or Ponca, or any of the other tribes that were in the Omaha area. That was really the first music that came to the place. When Europeans spread and colonized the West, when they came into the Omaha region for the first time, they brought a lot of their historical European traditions. Of course, the Irish settlers brought not just their songs, but their tin whistles and all of those other elements. Early pianos came in on the trains and by wagon train, pulled by horses. And eventually that became more. The key pioneers, the real early musicians who made North Omaha notable, included a man named George McPherson. George McPherson was called Professor McPherson because he was this virtuoso pianist. He had these spectacular powers of playing piano and just mesmerized all kinds of audiences. He taught students who were both white and black. He was an African American performer himself who came to North Omaha in the 1870s and really laid out the foundation for all music in North Omaha to grow and flourish from. But Professor McPherson was just the first. The second notable music teacher from North Omaha was named Flora Pinkston. Flora um, established an early music school. She was classically trained in the East, in Boston, and eventually she went to Europe and came back to Omaha, to North Omaha, and established a music practice, the Pinkston Music Conservatory, that kept teaching students for more than 60 years. Flora Pinkston's role in North Omaha is unparalleled, really, even to this day, if only because she didn't just teach students, she taught entire generations of choir directors from North Omaha churches. And churches like Mount Zion, St. John's AME, Salem Baptist, they all trace their musical lineage back to Flora Pinkston. Another notable name was Hosea Waddle. Hosea Waddle was a Civil War veteran. They even called him Professor Waddle. He was a Civil War veteran who wore his Civil War garb. He had on his hat and his medals on his uniform, and he taught all kinds of students, but he also started some of the city's first ever jazz bands, and even before jazz, ragtime, and even before ragtime, military bands. Professor Waddle put together the city's first African American musical group that we can trace and really see its name. The other thing that Professor Waddle did that's super notable is that he started one of the first female only bands in Omaha at the turn of the 20th century, right in 1900. So Professor Waddle left a really big footprint that also continued. Some of his students went on to become international performers, including Helen Jones Woods, who was a brass player with the international, I'm not going to remember their name, great big band that traveled the world of women players, but she got her start with Professor Waddle. And then, of course, one of the most influential of all of the early band leaders was Dan Desdunes. Dan Desdunes was an influential band leader and an advocate for music who actually came to Omaha from New Orleans. In New Orleans, Desdunes was part of the early civil rights movement and really fought for civil rights there as a young man. And when he got to Omaha, started into the music scene immediately, bringing his heritage and roots as a Creole from New Orleans and really bringing that up to Omaha. He started his own band. He started the band for the Boys Town in its first incarnation ever. And he toured the nation for Father Flanagan to raise money for Boys Town with the Boys Town band. So Desdunes was super influential, not just with Boys Town, but with the entire city of Omaha. His African American band became the first ever official band for the Omaha Chamber of Commerce. And Desdunes was involved in touring the country and raising the fervor for Omaha's business community in a way that nobody else ever had before that. So that was pretty exciting to see. The other thing that's really notable about Desdunes was who carried on his legacy after he was done, because a lot of these early artists weren't just about starting their bands and then moving on in life or dying or whatever. They actually laid these seeds and planted this foundation for North Omaha's musical legacy to continue into the future. Desdunes, one of his band members, his last name was Bryant. And you might be familiar today with the Bryant Center at 24th and Grant. The Bryant Center was named after Desdunes' student who eventually became his successor and carried forth his band's legacy into the 50s and 60s. So Dan Desdunes really laid this big footprint that a lot of people ended up following into the future. Now, right at that cusp, Steve, right at that point between 1900, 1910, 1920, right in that era, North Omaha's music scene began to transform. They had early ragtime bands. Desdunes really laid that foundation for ragtime, taking on its roots in North Omaha. But ragtime eventually grew into jazz. And what we understand is the jazz legacy from the 20s and 30s really took that foundation in North Omaha in the 1910s. North Omaha became so important to the jazz scene nationally that it was eventually known as kind of a AAA league. That's what Preston Love Sr. called it, a AAA league for the national jazz scene. Omaha, being right in the middle of the nation, was an essential stop for all the bands that travel from New York to LA on the Union Pacific Railroad and the other railroads that ran through the Union Station. And they would stop in Omaha and play gigs at the Dreamland Ballroom, at the Carnation Ballroom, and in other spots in downtown Omaha. And all these performers really had these awesome experiences. Lots of the biggest names that you can imagine. Duke Ellington played at the Dreamland Ballroom. Sarah Vaughan played at the Dreamland Ballroom. Louis Armstrong, when he was young and later on when he got famous, played at the Dreamland Ballroom. And they were coming through on their way to other places, but that's really what seeded the Dreamland Ballroom and other places in North Omaha and their essence and importance to the national jazz scene. In this picture here in my background, this is 24th and Lake in the 1940s. And at this point, 24th and Lake was really the nexus of this jazz culture. It wasn't just the Dreamland. Like I said, the Carnation Ballroom was up at 24th and Miami. The Offbeat Club was just to the west of 24th and Lake. Eventually, Allen's Showcase emerged in the 1950s, right on the corner of 24th and Lake, opposite of this building, catty corner from this building. Was what we call the Blue Lion Center today, or the Union Center for Contemporary Arts. The Union for Contemporary Arts has restored the space and made the building beautiful again, but its historic legacy is that it was home to McGill's Blue Room. McGill's Blue Room was one of the featured places for jazz musicians who came to Omaha to perform, who were traveling through. But the secret of McGill's Blue Room was that it wasn't a big old ballroom that had dance floor and space for tables and all of that kind of elaborate scene. McGill's Blue Room was one of those smoky jazz back rooms. And they served nice drinks, but it wasn't fancy. And they had great atmosphere, but it wasn't contrived. Instead, it was that authentic jazz space that we all like to imagine when we think about that music. That vibrant scene is really what laid that concrete foundation for North Omaha's historical legacy with music. But another reality of music in North Omaha was the truth of segregation. It was really difficult for African American performers, not necessarily to get venues to perform in Omaha, which I've mentioned and which were readily available. The challenge was actually in them finding places to stay. And that is how Omaha became, and particularly North Omaha became essential for these national jazz performers and blues performers and other performers who were coming through to stay there on their way through. Listed in the Green Book, which was a tourist book for African American motorists driving across the country, were several locations in North Omaha where Black performers could stay. I've tracked those hotels and we'll talk about them in another episode, but they were a really essential part of the North Omaha music scene, were the cultural places where people would stay. Key performers from and in North Omaha at this point included Preston Love Sr., who I've mentioned. Preston Love got his start with Count Basie and eventually recorded with Motown. But Preston went on to establish his own big band and carried that into the 1960s. Wynonie Harris was an early blues shouter. His whole genre of music was wrapped around this notion of blues, not as some kind of a soul and sad, low performance, but a big, loud, rambling performance. And today, Wynonie Harris is recognized from North Omaha, got his start at the Offbeat Club right at 24th and Lake. Wynonie Harris is recognized as one of the founders of rock and roll. Right from North Omaha. It's this magnificent thing. And there were a lot of other performers. I mentioned, the International Sweethearts of Rhythm. That was the band that Carol Woods played horns for. That the leader of that band was a woman named Anna Mae Winburn. And Anna Winburn, she was famous before she started the International Sweethearts. The International Sweethearts got their start in North Omaha and then toured the United States and toured the world and had mild fame. Their biggest claim to fame, though, and their biggest reputation in the late 40s was that they were an all-female orchestra. And so in that capacity, really laid more of that foundation to have that awesome role. Music in North Omaha kept evolving, Steve, and it was this whole beautiful thing. Of course, the entire time that all of this was going on that I've mentioned, we also had the effects of gospel music in North Omaha and the churches that really laid that foundation. One of the early phenomena in gospel music was the establishment of quartets inside of churches. And North Omaha wasn't short of these quartets, but they were basically small groups of often women players only, but sometimes men, and they would sing. And their music took the form that we understand gospel to be today. Of course, gospel traces its roots all the way back to Africa and has a really deep foundations, but it really took hold with these quartets. These quartets of musicians eventually started playing with accompaniments, and those accompaniments were easiest when they were guitars. And the blues scene evolved still in North Omaha with all these quartets coming out of the gospel scene and combining that jazz feeling. So suddenly we have the emergence of blues. We also had pop and soul starting to come around. The late 20th century, we had KOWH, the first ever African American led station in Omaha for Black audiences. You got to remember, radio stations back then, meaning anytime before the 70s, were super segregated. They played what was called black music for black audiences, and it was intended to be a different music experience than the white radio stations that played white music for white audiences. That segregation of the earballs was a real thing, you know. And KOWH was in their role, they began to shapeshift and transform starting in 1970 when they got a launch. Of course, KOWH was around long before that. But when it went up for sale, Black investors took it over, including Johnny Rogers and several other investors. A man named Rodney Weed was really the person who spearheaded that effort and created that foundation. And for the next 9 years, KOWH was North Omaha's radio station. It was the jam that everybody wanted to listen to. Not only did they play Black music, though, and what was regarded as Black music, they also played pop. They also played soul. They also played blues. They also played jazz. And it had this great impact on the community. By then, the Dreamland Ballroom was dialing down. By then, Carnation Ballroom had closed. Carnation Ballroom, separate note really quick, played an important role in the early careers of several people who we came to understand as vital to American music, including B.B. King, who as a young man played several nights at the Carnation over many different stops. James Brown, when he was a young man, before the screaming and wailing that really took his form and made him into who he was, played the Carnation Ballroom several times. Carnation was special for a couple reasons. First being that it was established by Mildred Brown. We know Mildred's name because was the founder and publisher of the Omaha Star newspaper, the only African American newspaper in Nebraska, the longest running and is still going. Mildred Brown started the Carnation Ballroom because she wanted a safe place for teens to go to listen to music. And she established it as a non-alcoholic, non-adult space. Of course, adults came. They wanted to listen to B.B. King. They wanted to listen to James Brown. They wanted to listen to all of the other musicians who came through. But it was a safe, calm, good place to be for several years. It closed within a decade. And by 1960, all that transformation was happening. All the things were shifting. We saw places like King Solomon's Mines up on Ames Avenue evolved and became a spectacular venue for a while. And then by the 1980s, things changed again. Hip hop was emerging nationally, and North Omaha didn't die down the way that people thought. North Omaha held a lot of the elements of hip hop culture. People like Scribble, aka Houston Alexander, came around and helped bring that hip hop culture into North Omaha. Houston eventually became, of course, a mixed martial artist who became involved in fighting nationally, but he was also a radio DJ and held down a lot of the hip hop culture for a long time, promoting North Omaha's role in hip hop. Modern contributors to the scene include people like the rapper and producer Marcy Yates and the Culture House on 24th Street that are really promoting North Omaha as being an ongoing musical venue. The NOMA is an important legacy institution at 24th and Lake that's really providing a jazz space and performance space for artists, African American artists, especially in North Omaha. There are other places that are happening all around the community, but I think it's super essential to understand that incredible breadth of musical history has all of these roots, all the way from McPherson, Professor McPherson and Flora Pinkston, all the way to Preston Love Sr., all the way to Marcy Yates today. And I'd love to look out and see that view of resilience and innovation and community building that has such depth and purpose. These modern institutions that I've mentioned, the Noma Academy, the Dreamland Plaza. Of course, there was the Omaha Black Music Hall of Fame. Look that up on Wikipedia and learn about what they've done to recognize Black musicians in North Omaha. All of it's augmented and supplemented by understanding the depth of the places, the beauty of the people, and the spectacularness behind this history. For more information about the history of music in North Omaha, check out northomahahistory.com and keep your ear to the street because it's still going on today. It's thriving and growing. And that is where we learn about the past of music in North Omaha. Steve?
Okay. Let's see. Stop recording.